1977, I've been studying local agroecology, mostly in how rice field biodiversity provides ecosystem services of natural pest regulation, especially in intensified Green Revolution crop systems, and found that if one removes the use of insecticides in those systems, one reduces the chances of getting major pest outbreaks. So my first example on agroecology as a response to a system failure caused by the overuse of inputs or an overshoot in a system dynamic language. If a system overshoots, it has to recover. And in the case of pesticides in rice through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were bundled together with conventional intensification programs that eventually became called the Green Revolution. All the pesticides were there actually before the seeds, but it was thought to be modern. One had to use inputs. People used pesticides. They destroyed the populations of natural enemies, of spiders and wasps and small water bugs that run on the surface of the rice paddy. By destroying those, you made it possible for major rice outbreak pests, including something called the rice brown planthopper, to explode in population because there wasn't anything killing it. And the populations would increase between 500 and 1,000 times, and in many cases completely destroyed rice fields. The more insecticides were sprayed, the worse the damage got. So that governments, after a few years of this, and it takes several years before you get out of the denial phase in a policy sense of, oh, there's a bug problem, spray it more, when spraying more produced more losses and did not save the crops, they began to look for other answers. And that's where I began working in the middle 1970s. When we removed the insecticides, it took usually anywhere from 3 months to 9 months for rice ecosystems to recover. Often they were drawing the natural enemies from natural wetlands that were nearby. So again, it was an ecosystem service being provided from the environment, moving into the rice paddies. And you could reestablish biological control of the pest and be able to grow rice. And this is serious, high production Green Revolution rice, growing anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 tons of paddy rice as it's harvested per hectare per crop, almost always in double cropped areas. So you were growing more than 10 tons of cereal per hectare in that system without using any insecticides. And that was eventually understood more and more widely. And a number of governments changed their policies, including Indonesia, India, Vietnam, parts of China, Bangladesh, and under a lower pesticide use system, we're able to continue increasing total national rice production. So that agroecology, which is based on ecosystem principles and understanding of an ecosystem as the beginning, was a natural kind of a response to that. I think that in more recent years, we've understood better the role of the natural wetlands as a source of the natural enemies of the pests. And so the beginning of landscape thinking is coming in. In doing this in the beginning of the 1990s, we developed something called farmer field schools that allow farmers to do ecosystem analyses. And the farmers do ecosystem analyses in the rice fields in a typical rice crop area in Asia. Every week, they come together for a half day, do an analysis looking at the numbers of pests, natural enemies, stage of the rice crop, other parts of the ecosystem, plants that are growing, and base their decisions on managing the crop the next week from their observations and their shared analysis. So the farmers are the scientists, and they make an agroecological analysis, make a drawing, and then share it as just like a scientific symposium, like we're here for 2 days at a scientific symposium. This is done by farmers in groups of 20 to 30 every week. In more than 60 countries now around the world where farmer field schools are operating, since the beginning of the 1990s, something over 10 million farmers have gone through farmer field schools and have talked about ecosystem processes. My second example of overshoot is with fertilizer. Again, fertilizers are overused, especially in the two big countries, China and India. Fertilizers are often overused, they're subsidized so that they're quite cheap, and in particular urea fertilizer, but some others as well. Instead of going for a balance, they overuse certain fertilizers. If the fertilizers aren't absorbed by the crop, they run out, usually in water, and the resulting pollution is a problem in coastal areas when the water gets out that far, including the creation of algal blooms and other kinds of large-scale ecosystem disruptions that then produce either temporary or longer-term dead zones, so that one has a real perception of an overuse of an input that, again, once we start looking, and we've just had a very good discussion in the scientific session with Professor Zhang from China about particularly nitrogen fertilizer, showing how yields of cereals will go down if you overuse nitrogen. And if you overuse nitrogen early in the season, root growth will be smaller, which means your overall growth of the crop will be less. Again, this is a counterintuitive observation, and the immediate reaction in most agricultural administrations is denial. They say, that's not possible. How can that be? But with enough time, Professor Zhang said it took at least 10 years in China, and I think that's a very realistic assessment, for people to gather the observations and information that overuse of fertilizer, first of all, is more prevalent than policymakers think, and secondly, is more damaging to production than either policymakers and most scientists want to think. And as a result, you begin to get the idea of limiting the use of inputs and reaching the necessary productivity targets without using, and in fact using less input, so that your production per unit of input, the crop per drop of pesticide, the crop per drop of fertilizer, the crop per drop of water increases. And that's a kind of a policy actionable version of efficiency. Now, vulnerability. The sense of vulnerability of a system was well explained in a talk just now by Dr. Nichols, who's at Berkeley, with the experiences of hurricanes, of cyclonic events, extreme weather events in Central America or Mexico, showing that agroecological farms suffered less, showed greater resilience to extreme weather events than conventional or industrial style farms. And this has been published by several people. I think Eric Holt Jimenez is one of the people, but there's some others as well that have published these kinds of results subsequent to extreme weather events. Since extreme weather events are some of the now more frequent signs of climate change, of global warming, I think this is something that we should use as an indicator. That we should look at the vulnerability of the system, look at agroecological farms as more resilient, and therefore try to take steps both to move along an agroecological path in areas that have high frequencies of extreme weather in the cyclone belts, both in the Caribbean and in the Western Pacific, and that this is a very reasonable policy action to come out. But again, the idea is you've overshot your limits of resilience. You've made the system more vulnerable because it's so much less resilient, and that in all the more likely climate scenarios, we're going to have to prepare people better for it, and agroecology certainly has been shown to be effective in that.